There are names that echo through history, but only a handful are spoken with the kind of reverence typically reserved for gods, and among them, one stands alone, a name that has become synonymous with the very concept of genius itself, Leonardo da Vinci. Even now, 5 centuries after his death, his creations are among the most famous in human history. The Mona Lisa's enigmatic smile is more recognizable than the face of almost any living celebrity. The Last Supper, a masterpiece of psychological drama frozen in time. His Vitruvian Man, the perfect fusion of art and mathematics, has become a universal symbol of human potential. His empire was not one of land or gold, but of the mind, an empire so vast it remains uncharted territory. He was a painter who revolutionized the use of light and shadow, a sculptor who could breathe life into bronze and marble, an architect who designed cities of the future, an anatomist who peeled back the layers of the human body to understand its intricate machinery. Centuries ahead of his time, a botanist, a musician, a philosopher, and a weapons designer, a military engineer who sold his services to the most ruthless princes of the Italian Renaissance, devising instruments of war with a chillingly detached brilliance. This is the central paradox of Leonardo da Vinci. The story we are told is of a gentle, bearded sage, a painter of divine beauty. But that is only half the truth, and as we shall see, the other half is far more complex and far more troubling. What makes Leonardo so problematic is that his light side was every bit as brilliant as his dark side was terrifying. He was a man who dreamed of flight while simultaneously designing giant crossbows that could hurl immense boulders, Sith chariots to mow down soldiers like wheat, and even a primitive armored tank, a harbinger of industrial warfare. He was a man who sought the patronage of tyrants like Cesare Borgia, a man whose cruelty was so legendary he became the very model for Machiavelli's The Prince. Leonardo served as Borgia's chief engineer and general inspector of fortifications, mapping his territories for conquest and designing deadlier, more efficient ways to kill. His story is at times inspiring and at times chilling. It is an example of what happens when boundless curiosity and ambition go completely unchecked by traditional morality, when the pursuit of knowledge becomes its own justification for anything. He would clash with titans of his own age, most notably the brilliant, tempestuous, and much younger Michelangelo. Their rivalry was the talk of Florence, a bitter and public feud between the colossal egos, culminating in a head-to-head artistic battle that would be lost to history. And it all began from the most humble of origins. He was not born into power or wealth. He was born a bastard, the illegitimate son of a provincial notary and a peasant girl, a stain on his name that would bar him from the universities and respectable professions of his time. It was this very stigma, this mark of shame, that would set him on his unique path. It forced him to become an autodidact, to learn not from dusty books in Latin, but from the one book he truly revered, the book of nature, of direct experience and relentless observation. Today, we will pull back the curtain on the myth of Leonardo. We will expose the carefully constructed image of the Renaissance saint to reveal the man beneath, a man driven by an insatiable, almost frightening, curiosity, a man who likely dug up freshly buried corpses in the dead of night to conduct his anatomical research, defying the church and risking everything for a glimpse at the secrets of the human form. A genius so profound that it alienated him from his peers, and a perfectionist whose ambition was so great that he left a trail of magnificent, unfinished masterpieces in his wake. This is the story of how an outcast, illegitimate boy from a small Tuscan town became the very symbol of the Renaissance. It is a story of ambition, obsession, genius, and the dark symbiosis between the creator of beauty and the architects of war. This is the story of the real Leonardo da Vinci, and it starts, as all great stories do, at the beginning. Chapter 1. The illegitimate son. The year is 1452. The place, the small, sun-drenched hill town of Vinci, in the heart of the Republic of Florence. This is the epicenter of a cultural explosion that history will come to call the Renaissance. A time of rebirth, of rediscovery, a time when the rigid dogmas of the Middle Ages were beginning to crack under the pressure of a new philosophy, humanism, a belief in the power, potential, and inherent dignity of humankind. It is into this world of radical change and artistic fervor that Leonardo is born. But he is not born into one of the great Florentine families, the Medici, the Pazzi, the Strozzi, who commissioned the art and pulled the strings of power. He is born in a humble farmhouse in the hamlet of Onciano, just outside the town walls. His father is a man named Serpiero da Vinci, a respected local notary. Notaries were a crucial part of Florentine society, the legal professionals who drew up contracts, wills, and deeds. They were men of letters, of precision. But Serpiero's ambition extended beyond his profession. On April 15th, he records the birth of his son in the family diary. But something is missing. The mother's name. She was a girl named Caterina de Miolippi, a local peasant. Some historians speculate she may have even been an enslaved person from the Middle East, a common feature in wealthy Italian households at the time. What is certain is that she was of a lower class. She and Serpiero were not married, and in the eyes of 15th century law and society, this made their son, Leonardo, a figlio natural, an illegitimate child. This single fact would define the first 2 decades of Leonardo's life. It was a brand, a social handicap that slammed many doors shut before he could even approach them. Serpiero would go on to marry a woman of his own class, Albera Amadori, and start a legitimate family. Caterina, the peasant girl, was quickly married off to a local artisan. Their son, Leonardo, was left in a strange limbo. He was acknowledged by his father, and for the first few years of his life, lived with his mother. But eventually, he was taken into his father's household in Vinci. He lived under the same roof as his father, his stepmother, and eventually, his many legitimate half-siblings. He was part of the family, yet distinctly other. The stigma of illegitimacy was not just social, it was legal. As a bastard, Leonardo was barred from attending university. The great centers of learning in Padua and Bologna were closed to him. He could not become a doctor or a lawyer. He could not even follow his father into the respectable profession of a notary. The formal, Latin-based education that was the gateway to the intellectual elite was denied to him. And so, his education came from elsewhere. It came from the world around him, from the winding streams and olive groves of the Tuscan countryside, from the workshops of the local craftsmen, from the sky, the earth, the flight of a bird, the anatomy of a dragonfly. Denied the received wisdom of the ancients, he was forced to learn for himself, to trust only what he could see with his own eyes. This became the foundational principle of his entire life, sapere videre, to know how to see. Even as a boy, his powers of observation were uncanny. The 16th century biographer Giorgio Vasari, in his famous book The Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, tells stories of Leonardo's youth. While other boys were playing games, Leonardo was drawing. He would model figures in clay. He was fascinated by geometry, but his questions were so probing and complex that they often confounded his masters. He was left-handed, another mark of peculiarity in an age that often saw it as a sign of the devil. He wrote his notes in a strange mirror script, from right to left, a practice that has fueled centuries of speculation. Was it to keep his ideas secret, or was it simply easier for a left-handed man to write this way, without smudging the ink? The truth, as with so much of Leonardo, is likely a combination of the practical and the enigmatic. His father, Serpiero, recognized the boy's talent. He saw that while the path of a scholar was closed, the path of an artist was not. The guilds of Florence, the associations of craftsmen, were more meritocratic. What mattered there was not your birth, but the skill of your hands and the sharpness of your eye. Vasari tells a key story. A local peasant brought a round wooden shield, a rotella, to Serpiero and asked him to have it painted in Florence. Serpiero, seeing an opportunity, gave it to his son. The young Leonardo wanted to create something truly terrifying that would have the same effect as the head of Medusa, sequestered himself in a room. He gathered a collection of lizards, newts, crickets, snakes, butterflies, locusts, and bats. From this menagerie of crawling and flying things, he combined their various parts to create a single, monstrous creature, breathing fire and smoke from its open mouth. When he was finished, he brought his father to the darkened room. Serpiero, not knowing what to expect, recoiled in terror, believing the painted beast was real. At that moment, Leonardo knew he had succeeded. He told his father, "This work serves the purpose for which it was made. Take it, then, and carry it away, for this is the effect it was meant to produce." Serpiero, stunned by his son's genius, recognized this was far too good for a peasant's shield. He sold it to a Florentine art dealer for 100 ducats, who then sold it to the Duke of Milan for 300. Whether the story is literally true or not, it illustrates a crucial point. Leonardo's art was not just about creating beauty. It was about creating an effect. It was about understanding psychology, about manipulating the viewer's emotions. It was a science. By the age of 14, around the year 1466, his future was decided. Ser Piero took his son to Florence, the undisputed capital of art and commerce in Italy. He took him to the workshop, or bottega, of the most famous artist in the city, Andrea del Verrocchio. Verrocchio's studio was not some quiet, contemplative space. It was a bustling, multifaceted factory of art and engineering. Verrocchio was a goldsmith, a painter, a sculptor, and an engineer. His workshop received commissions for everything from massive bronze statues and ornate altarpieces to decorative helmets and parade banners. It was here that a young apprentice would learn not just how to paint, but how to grind pigments, prepare wooden panels, cast in bronze, and understand the principles of mechanics. For a boy like Leonardo, denied a formal education, this was the perfect university. It was a place of hands-on experimentation. He was surrounded by other talented young artists, including future masters like Sandro Botticelli and Pietro Perugino. The competition was fierce, the standards impossibly high, and it was here, in the workshop of Verrocchio, that the illegitimate boy from Vinci would first make his mark, and in doing so, begin to eclipse his own master. The commission was for a large painting, the Baptism of Christ. Verrocchio, as the master, painted the main figures of Christ and John the Baptist. He assigned his young apprentice, Leonardo, the task of painting a single, kneeling angel in the bottom left corner. When it was finished, the difference was staggering. Verrocchio's figures were excellent, rendered in the somewhat stiff, linear style of the early Renaissance, but Leonardo's angel was something else entirely. It seemed to be made of flesh and spirit, not paint. The turn of its head was natural, the curls of its hair were soft and alive, and the face held an expression of serene, otherworldly grace. He had used a new technique, sfumato, a subtle blending of tones and colors to create a hazy, atmospheric effect, eliminating harsh outlines. Vasari claims that when Verrocchio saw what his pupil had done, he was so humbled by the fact that a boy should know more than he, that he resolved never to touch a brush again. This is likely an exaggeration, but it captures the essence of the moment. A new force had arrived in the art world. Leonardo had not just learned the rules of his master's workshop. He had internalized them, perfected them, and then, effortlessly, broken them to create something new. His illegitimacy had denied him a traditional path, but it had granted him a kind of freedom. A freedom from assumption, a freedom from dogma. It forced him to invent his own methods, to forge his own destiny. And as he stepped out from the shadow of Verrocchio, a fully fledged master in his own right, the great powers of Italy began to take notice, not just for his art, but for his mind-to-mind that was already moving beyond painting, into the realms of engineering, anatomy, and the dark arts of war. Chapter 2. A dangerous mind. Florence in the late 15th century was a city of ferocious competition. To succeed here, an artist needed more than just talent. They needed connections, a powerful patron, and a ruthless ambition that matched the city's own. Having been admitted to the prestigious Guild of St. Luke in 1472, Leonardo was officially a master painter, free to take on his own commissions. And for a time, he did. He operated out of his own studio, yet still collaborated on projects in Verrocchio's bustling workshop. His first major independent works began to emerge, and each one was a quiet revolution. There was the portrait of the young, melancholic noblewoman, Ginevra di Benci, while other artists painted their subjects in profile, a flat, almost coin-like representation. Leonardo turned her to face the viewer. He painted her not in a lavish interior, but outdoors, surrounded by a misty, atmospheric landscape that seemed to reflect her inner mood. It was a psychological portrait, a window into a soul. But even as his reputation grew, a pattern began to emerge, a pattern that would haunt his entire career. In 1481, he received a major commission from the monks of San Donato e Scapito for a massive altarpiece, the Adoration of the Magi. This was a chance to create a defining masterpiece, to cement his status as the preeminent painter in Florence. He threw himself into the work with a feverish intensity. Dozens of preparatory drawings survive, showing his mind at work. He dissected the scene, experimenting with every possible composition, studying the expressions of every face, the anatomy of every horse. He abandoned the traditional, serene depiction of the scene. In Leonardo's vision, the arrival of the Christ child is a moment of cosmic disruption. The world is thrown into chaos. Figures surge around the Madonna and child, their faces contorted in awe, confusion, and spiritual revelation. In the background, a pagan temple crumbles as riders on rearing horses engage in desperate battle. It was to be a theological and artistic thesis on the meaning of the Incarnation. And then, he stopped. The painting, a whirlwind of brilliant underdrawing on a primed wooden panel, was left radically unfinished. A ghostly masterpiece of raw potential. Why walk away from such a monumental work? Some say it was his obsessive perfectionism, a feeling that he could never truly capture the divine vision in his mind. Others point to a more practical reason. Leonardo's ambition had outgrown Florence. He had his eyes on a bigger prize. But before he could make his next move, his world came crashing down. On April 9, 1476, a slip of paper was deposited into the tambour of the public accusation box at the Palazzo della Signoria, Florence's town hall. It was an anonymous denunciation. It accused a young goldsmith of sodomy, and it named for other men as his partners. One of those names was Leonardo da Vinci. In Renaissance Florence, sodomy was considered a heinous crime. It was vigorously prosecuted by a special court, the officers of the night. The penalty, if found guilty, was public humiliation, crippling fines, and in some cases, burning at the stake. For Leonardo, a 24-year-old artist whose entire career depended on his reputation and the patronage of the church and wealthy families, this was a death sentence, whether it was carried out by fire or by social ruin. The accusation sent a shockwave through the city's artistic community. Importantly, Leonardo was not the only prominent name on the list. Another was Leonardo Tornabuoni, a scion of one of Florence's most powerful banking families, who were closely allied with the Medici, the de facto rulers of the city. The case proceeded. Leonardo and the others were interrogated. For 2 months, his life hung in the balance. The secrecy of his notebooks, his lack of interest in marriage, his preference for surrounding himself with handsome young male assistants, all of this could now be used as evidence against him. It was a moment of supreme vulnerability. Then, on June 16th, the case was dismissed. The official reason was a lack of corroborating witnesses. The anonymous accuser never came forward. But it is far more likely that the political influence of the Tornabuoni family, and by extension the Medici, was brought to bear. A public scandal involving one of their own was simply not an option. Leonardo was saved, not by his innocence, but by his powerful connections. The ordeal left a deep scar. He had stared into the abyss. He had seen how quickly his life and career could be destroyed by a hidden enemy, by the rigid morality of the establishment. The experience seems to have deepened his already secretive nature. He became more guarded, more aloof, and perhaps it solidified a growing belief in his mind. Florence, for all its artistic glory, was a cage, a republic of merchants and gossips governed by laws that could be turned against him on a whim. He needed a different kind of patron. He needed a ruler whose power was absolute, a man who stood above the petty laws that governed lesser men. He found him in Milan. The man was Ludovico Sforza, known as Il Moro, the Moro on account of his dark complexion. Sforza was not the rightful Duke of Milan. He was a regent, ruling in the name of his young, sickly nephew. He held his power precariously through cunning, force, and extravagant displays of wealth and culture. Milan was not a republic like Florence. It was a military dictatorship, a duchy that required constant defense and projected strength. Ludovico needed weapons, fortifications, and spectacle. And in Leonardo, he saw a man who could provide it all. Around 1482, Leonardo made his move. He composed what is surely the most audacious job application in history. It took the form of a letter, or a memorandum, sent to Ludovico, outlining his skills. And this is where we see the other face of Leonardo, the face he deliberately cultivated for the powerful. The letter contains 10 paragraphs of detailed, chillingly practical military engineering. Art is mentioned only as an afterthought. He begins, "Most illustrious lord, having now sufficiently considered the specimens of all those who proclaim themselves skilled contrivers of instruments of war, I shall endeavor to explain myself to your excellency, showing your lordship my secrets." And what secrets they were. He promised he had methods for constructing light, strong, portable bridges to pursue and rout an enemy. He could drain the water from the moats of besieged fortresses. He could destroy any fortress whose foundations had not been built on stone. The list grows more terrifying. "I have methods for making cannons, very convenient and easy to transport," he writes, "with which to hurl small stones almost like a hailstorm." He describes designing armored vehicles, safe and unassailable, which will enter the enemy ranks with their artillery. And there is no company of men at arms so great that they will not break through it. And behind these, the infantry will be able to follow quite unharmed and without any opposition. This was, in essence, the modern tank, conceived for 100 years before it would churn across the battlefields of World War I. He offered to make catapults, mongonals, and trebuchets of beautiful and useful design. He spoke of secret underground tunnels, of silent cannons, of Sith chariots that would slice through enemy lines. He was selling himself not as a painter, but as a master of destruction, a one-man research and development wing for a modern army. Only at the very end, in a short, final paragraph, does he add, almost casually, in time of peace I believe I can give perfect satisfaction, and to the equal of any other in architecture and the construction of buildings. I can carry out sculpture in marble, bronze, or clay, and also I can do in painting whatever may be done, as well as any other, be he who he may. And as a final, brilliant hook, he dangles the one project he knows the usurper Ludovico needs to legitimize his rule. Moreover, the bronze horse may be taken in hand, which is to be to the immortal glory and eternal honor of the prince your father of happy memory, and of the illustrious house of Sforza. This was his gambit. He understood that to a man like Sforza, a beautiful painting was a luxury, but a war machine that could guarantee victory, that was a necessity. Art was the velvet glove, but military engineering was the iron fist. He arrived in Milan not with a portfolio of paintings, but with a musical instrument of his own design, a silver lyre crafted in the shape of a horse's skull. It was a piece of bizarre, captivating showmanship, perfectly calculated to appeal to the Milanese court's love of the exotic. He was immediately welcomed into Sforza's circle, not primarily as a painter, but as a musician, a designer of elaborate court festivals and pageants, and, most importantly, as a military and civil engineer. He had successfully traded the merchant princes of Florence for the military tyrant of Milan. He had left behind the unfinished adoration and the shame of his public accusation. He had entered the service of a man who could fund his wildest ambitions, a man who had need of both his light and his dark genius. Here in Milan, under the patronage of Ludovico Sforza, Leonardo da Vinci would spend the next 17 years. It would be the most productive period of his life, a time when he would create his most famous work of art and design his most terrifying instruments of war. He was no longer just an artist. He was an architect of power. Chapter 3, The Duke's Magician. Upon arriving in Milan, Leonardo was not simply given a studio and a palette. He was absorbed into the very fabric of Ludovico Sforza's regime. For the next 17 years, he would serve as the Duke's personal polymath, a courtly wizard tasked with a dizzying array of responsibilities. His official title was Pictor et Ingeniaris Ducalis, painter and engineer of the Duke, but his real role was far grander. He was the architect of Ludovico's image. Ludovico, the usurper, needed to project an aura of legitimate, sophisticated, and unassailable power, and Leonardo was his chief propagandist. He became a master of spectacle, the producer of the most elaborate and technologically advanced court festivals in all of Europe. When a Sforza wedding was to be celebrated, it was Leonardo who designed the costumes. When a visiting dignitary needed to be impressed, it was Leonardo who devised the automated wonders and theatrical machinery that would leave them breathless. For one famous pageant, the Festa del Paradiso, he constructed a massive, mechanized recreation of the heavens. It featured a rotating, gilded hemisphere representing the zodiac, with actors playing the 7 planets, each in their own orbit, reciting celebratory verses as they moved. It was a dazzling fusion of engineering, art, and political flattery, designed to portray Ludovico not merely as a ruler, but as a kind of cosmic force around whom the entire world revolved. This was the core of his value to the Duke. He could manufacture reality. He could make a political claim Ludovico's greatness feel like an objective, observable fact. And all the while, he was working on the 2 great projects that would define his time in Milan. One was the promise he had made in his letter, the key that unlocked the door to the Sforza court, the great bronze horse. The other was a commission that would become the most famous religious painting in history. One was a monument to worldly power, the other, a window into a moment of divine tragedy. The horse was a project of almost insane ambition. It was to be a colossal equestrian statue of Francesco Sforza, Ludovico's father, the mercenary captain who founded the dynasty. This was a crucial piece of legitimization for Ludovico. But Leonardo, true to form, was not interested in creating a standard, static statue of a man on a horse. He envisioned a dynamic masterpiece, a war horse rearing up on its hind legs, hooves crashing down on a vanquished foe. No one had ever successfully cast a bronze statue of this size and complexity. The physics were a nightmare. The sheer weight of the molten bronze in the upper portions would cause the mold to burst before it could ever be filled. It was an engineering problem of the highest order, and Leonardo obsessed over it for years. He filled notebooks with anatomical studies of horses, dissecting them to understand the play of every muscle and sinew. He spent countless hours in the Duke's stables, watching the powerful destriers, sketching their movements until he knew them by heart. He devised an ingenious new method of casting, one that would allow him to pour the entire statue in a single, seamless operation. By 1493, after more than a decade of work, he was finally ready to present the first stage. He unveiled a full-scale clay model of the horse. It was immense. Standing over 23 feet tall, it was dubbed Il Colosso, the Colossus. It was the talk of Italy, a wonder of the age. All that remained was to cast it in the 70 tons of bronze that had been set aside for the project. But as Leonardo toiled on this monument to the Sforza dynasty, he was also pursuing a much more secret and far more dangerous line of research. His obsession with anatomy had grown from a simple artistic aid into a full-blown scientific quest. He wanted to understand the human machine from the inside out, and there was only one way to do that. In the dead of night, he began to conduct human dissections. This was an act fraught with peril. It was condemned by the church as a desecration of God's creation, and it was legally forbidden. The bodies he worked on were likely those of executed criminals or unclaimed paupers, obtained through clandestine arrangements with hospital officials or, as some whispered, by even darker means. In a secret room, by the light of a flickering candle, the man who painted sublime angels peeled back the skin, muscle, and bone of human corpses. His notebooks from this period are astonishing. They are filled with drawings of unparalleled accuracy and beauty. He drew the intricate architecture of the skeleton, the web of nerves and blood vessels, the chambers of the heart. He was the first person in history to correctly draw the human spine, the first to understand how heart valves worked, the first to produce a scientifically accurate drawing of a fetus in the womb. He was 100 years, in some cases 300 years, ahead of medical science. This was not the work of a ghoul. It was the work of a man possessed by a terrifyingly profound curiosity. He wrote of his experience, and if you should have a love for such things, you might be prevented by nausea. And if that did not prevent you, you might be prevented by the fear of living in the night hours in the company of these corpses. Quartered and flayed and horrifying to see, he was not prevented. His scientific coldness, his ability to detach from the horror of his subject in the pursuit of pure knowledge, was absolute. And this secret knowledge flowed directly back into his art. Nowhere is this more evident than in the second great work of his Milanese period, The Last Supper. Around 1495, Ludovico commissioned him to paint a mural in the refectory, the dining hall of the monastery of Santa Maria del Grazie. The subject was traditional for a dining hall, but Leonardo's execution was anything but. He rejected the time-tested and durable method of fresco painting, which required applying pigments to wet plaster. It was a fast, demanding technique that did not allow for second-guessing. Leonardo's mind was too restless for that. His process was one of slow, deliberate layering, of constant revision and refinement. So he decided to experiment. He treated the stone wall as if it were a wooden panel, sealing it with a layer of pitch and gesso, and then painting on the dry surface with tempera. It was an innovation that allowed him his characteristic slowness, his fumato blending, his obsessive attention to detail. It was also, catastrophically, an innovation that would begin to decay within his own lifetime. But the technical experiment was secondary to the psychological one. The central problem was this: how do you paint the souls of 13 men at the single most dramatic moment of their lives? Leonardo chose the instant after Christ utters the devastating words, "Verily I say unto you, that one of you shall betray me." The result is not a static tableau of saints. It is a human drama of electrifying intensity. A shockwave of motion and emotion ripples out from the serene, central figure of Christ. The apostles are thrown into turmoil, reacting in groups of 3. They are stunned, they argue, they protest their innocence, they demand to know who it is. Bartholomew, at the far end, has risen to his feet, his hands gripping the table. Peter lunges forward, a knife clutched in his hand, a premonition of the violence to come in the Garden of Gethsemane. The young John swoons in despair. And then there's Judas. Leonardo breaks with all tradition. He does not isolate Judas on the opposite side of the table, as was customary. He places him among the others, hidden in plain sight. He is the 4th figure from the left, recoiling into the shadows, his face darkened, his hand clutching a small bag of silver. He is a part of the group, yet utterly alone in his guilt. Vasari tells us that Leonardo's process was maddening for the monks. He would spend half a day staring at the wall, lost in thought, without picking up a brush. At other times, he would rush in from the midday sun at a single stroke and leave immediately. He was obsessed with finding the right human models. He wandered the streets and marketplaces of Milan, studying faces, searching for the perfect expression of innocence for one apostle, of indignation for another. The story goes that he struggled most with two faces, that of Christ, whose divine perfection he felt he could never capture, and that of Judas, whose treachery he needed to find in a real human being. The prior of the monastery, impatient with the delays, complained to Ludovico. Leonardo, when confronted, calmly explained that he was still searching for a face sufficiently evil for Judas. And then he added, with a cool detachment, that if he couldn't find one, he could always use the face of the meddling prior himself. The threat worked. The prior left him alone, and the painting was completed. By 1498, the Last Supper was finished. It was immediately hailed as a supreme masterpiece, a revolution in art. But even as Leonardo reached the pinnacle of his artistic achievement, the world he had built for himself was beginning to crumble. Ludovico Sforza's political machinations had finally caught up with him. His complex web of alliances had unraveled. In 1499, the French king, Louis XII, asserting an old claim to the Duchy of Milan, invaded Italy with a powerful army. Ludovico's own mercenary troops, sensing his weakness, began to desert him. His power, which Leonardo had worked so hard to project as absolute, was revealed to be a fragile illusion. As the French army approached, panic gripped Milan. The 70 tons of bronze that had been painstakingly set aside for Leonardo as colossal horse were hastily melted down and forged into cannons to defend the city. The needs of war, which had brought Leonardo to Milan in the first place, had now consumed his greatest artistic ambition. Ludovico fled the city. The French marched in, victorious, and they found Leonardo's masterpiece, the 23-foot-tall clay model of the horse, standing abandoned in its courtyard. To the invading soldiers, it was not a priceless work of art, a monument of a decade of genius. It was a symbol of the vanquished Sforza regime, and it was a perfect target. The Gascon archers used the Colossus for sport, amusing themselves by firing their crossbow bolts into the magnificent clay beast, chipping away at its form until the proud, rearing warhorse was nothing but a ruin. It was a devastating, brutally symbolic end to Leonardo's Milanese dream. His patron was overthrown, his salary gone. His most ambitious work, the project of nearly 2 decades, was destroyed by bored soldiers. His experimental masterpiece, The Last Supper, was already showing signs of flaking from the wall. At the age of 47, Leonardo da Vinci was once again a fugitive of fortune. He gathered his assistant Soleil and his friend, the mathematician Luca Pacioli, and fled the city he had called home for nearly 2 decades. The magician's theater had been torn down. The world was a dangerous and uncertain place, ruled by the whims of armies and kings. And to survive, the great master of art and science would soon have to place his dangerous mind in the service of an even more dangerous master, a man whose name would become a byword for cruelty and ruthless ambition, Cesare Borgia. Chapter 4. The Prince's Cartographer. The fall of Milan cast Leonardo out into a fractured and warring Italy. For a time, he drifted. He went to Mantua, where he drew a portrait of the cultured Marchioness Isabella d'Este. He traveled to Venice, where he was consulted on how to defend the city from a potential naval invasion by the Ottoman Turks, proposing a system of mobile underwater floodgates, a project of stunning originality that was, like so many others, deemed too ambitious to be realized. He then returned, briefly, to Florence. The city had changed. The Medici had been exiled. The fanatical friar Savonarola had risen and fallen, burned at the stake in the same piazza where he had once held his bonfire of the vanities. Now, Florence was a fragile republic, trying to reassert its authority over rebellious territories. And it was here that Leonardo came face to face with his only true rival. His name was Michelangelo Buonarroti. He was 23 years younger than Leonardo, and his polar opposite in almost every way. Where Leonardo was elegant, handsome, and aloof, Michelangelo was brutish, unkempt, and consumed by a fiery, volcanic passion. Leonardo approached art as a science, a cool intellectual pursuit. Michelangelo attacked it as a spiritual battle, wrestling with the marble to release the figure trapped within. They despised each other. Michelangelo publicly insulted Leonardo, mocking him for the failure of the Sforza horse, accusing him of being unable to finish anything he started. The city's leaders, in a stroke of genius or malice, decided to pit the two titans against each other. They were each commissioned to paint a massive battle fresco on opposite walls of the new council chamber in the Palazzo della Signoria. It was to be the ultimate artistic duel. Leonardo chose the Battle of Anghiari, Michelangelo, the Battle of Cassina. Leonardo once again threw himself into the preparation. He constructed an elaborate, movable scaffold. He studied the fury of battle, writing that a painter must show the flight, the audacity, the terror, and the licentiousness of the soldiers. His preparatory drawings, known as the Fight for the Standard, are a vortex of human and animal savagery, a terrifying tangle of screaming men and biting horses. So visceral, it seems to explode off the page. He again experimented with a new painting technique based on an ancient Roman recipe involving hot wax. And again, it was a disaster. The colors began to run and smudge almost as soon as he applied them. The project was another magnificent failure. He abandoned it, leaving only the central, half-ruined section. Michelangelo, for his part, was called back to Rome by the Pope before he could even begin painting his own fresco. The great duel of the giants never truly happened, but it was during this period, in the summer of 1502, that Leonardo took the most morally questionable job of his entire life. He left Florence and entered the service of a new patron. This was not a cultured duke like Ludovico Sforza. This was a man who was carving out a new kingdom for himself in central Italy through treachery, violence, and fear. His name was Cesare Borgia. Cesare Borgia was the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI. He was the commander of the papal armies, a brilliant military strategist, and a man of boundless ambition and utter ruthlessness. He was the serpent in the Italian garden, a man who murdered his own brother-in-law, who had his own captain strangled, and whose cruelty was so legendary that it would inspire Niccolò Machiavelli's seminal work on Power, the Prince. Machiavelli, who observed Borgia's campaigns firsthand as a Florentine diplomat, saw in him the perfect example of a new kind of ruler, one who understood that power flows not from morality or divine right, but from the efficient and unsentimental application of force. And for 1 year, Leonardo da Vinci was Cesare Borgia's chief military architect and engineer. He traveled with the Borgia war machine as it tore through the region of Romania, subjugating city after city. The man who painted the serene face of Christ was now working for the most feared man in Italy. His role was not to paint. It was to make Borgia's conquests more efficient. He was given a patent of authority, a passport signed by Cesare himself, which gave him unlimited power to requisition men, materials, and access to any fortress in the Borgia domains. The document praised Leonardo as his highly esteemed and dearly beloved architect, commanding everyone to allow him to see, measure, and value anything he may wish, and that they may not depart from his orders. With this document in hand, Leonardo undertook a series of whirlwind tours. He surveyed landscapes, designed fortifications, and planned strategic engineering works. He drew canals to divert rivers, hoping to cut off rebellious cities from their water supply. But his most significant and most revolutionary contribution was in the field of cartography. Maps at the time were often pictorial and inaccurate, more like artistic impressions of a landscape than scientific tools. Leonardo, applying his principle of sapere videre, knowing how to see, created something entirely new. He invented the science of modern map-making. He combined painstaking ground surveys with a technique of his own invention, the bird's eye view, or ethnographic map. He imagined himself hovering high above a city, and drew it not as it appeared from the side, but as a flat, two-dimensional plan, perfectly to scale. His map of the town of Imola is a masterpiece of military and scientific intelligence. Every street, every piazza, every wall and tower is rendered with breathtaking precision. It is a cold, clinical, godlike view of a city. For a commander like Cesare Borgia, this map was not a work of art. It was an instrument of control. It allowed him to understand the city as a system, to plan the movement of his troops, to identify strategic weaknesses, to dominate the space completely. Leonardo had given Borgia a new way to see the world, and therefore a new way to conquer it. There is a chilling detachment to Leonardo's work from this period. His notebooks are filled with these precise, beautiful, but utterly immoral maps and engineering sketches. There is no mention of the bloodshed, the violence, the terror that Borgia's campaign was inflicting upon the people of these cities. There is only the cool, analytical mind of the engineer, solving the problems put before him. Was he horrified by his master's cruelty? Or was he, like Machiavelli, simply fascinated by it? Did he see in Borgia a force of nature, a human experiment in the acquisition of absolute power, and was he content to simply observe and assist? The partnership was short-lived. In 1503, Cesare Borgia's world collapsed as suddenly as it had been built. His father, Pope Alexander VI, died possibly from malaria, possibly from poison. Without the protection and resources of the papacy, Cesare's enemies closed in. His carefully constructed state crumbled. He was arrested and would eventually die in a minor skirmish in Spain a few years later. Once again, Leonardo's patron had been swept away by the chaotic tides of Italian politics. He returned to Florence, his hands tainted by his association with the great tyrant. He had lent his genius to a monster, and in return, he had been given a year of unparalleled freedom to practice the full scope of his engineering skills. The experience seems to have marked him. He had seen the mechanics of power at their most raw and brutal. It was upon his return to Florence that he began work on a new painting, a simple portrait, commissioned by a wealthy silk merchant named Francesco del Giocondo, of his wife, Lisa Gherardini. It was a private, modest commission, a world away from the grand altarpieces and ducal monuments of his past. He would work on it for the rest of his life, carrying it with him on all his travels, adding layer upon layer of impossibly thin, translucent glazes. He would never deliver it to the man who commissioned it. It became his own private obsession, a laboratory for all his theories on art, anatomy, geology, and the human soul. He applied everything he knew. The sfumato technique he had perfected in the Last Supper was used to create a seamless transition between light and shadow, blurring the corners of the mouth and eyes, creating an expression that is famously ambiguous and seems to shift as you look at it. The anatomical knowledge gained from his secret dissections allowed him to capture the subtle structure of the face, the soft fleshiness of the hands. And behind her, he painted not a simple room or a generic landscape, but a strange, primordial world of jagged rocks and winding water, a geological dreamscape that seems to represent the vastness of time and nature itself. The woman in the portrait, Lisa del Giocondo, became known as Mona Lisa, and in her enigmatic smile, we see the culmination of Leonardo's life, the scientific precision, the deep psychological insight, and the profound sense of mystery that lay at the heart of his genius. He had looked into the face of war, served tyrants, and dissected the dead, and all of that knowledge, all of that experience, was now distilled into the quiet, knowing gaze of a single woman. Chapter 5. The last Titan having served a monster and survived, Leonardo returned to a Florence that was no longer his. The city was abuzz with the names of the new generation. The artistic duel with his sworn rival Michelangelo had fizzled into a technical and political failure. He was a living legend, but a legend from a previous age. And so, in 1513, at the age of 61, he made one last great bid for patronage, traveling to the one city that now eclipsed all others as the center of power in art, Rome. The new pope was Leo X, a member of the powerful Medici family, the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who had been the great patron of Leonardo as youth in Florence. It should have been a triumphant homecoming. Instead, it was a period of profound frustration and isolation. Rome was Michelangelo's city now. He had completed his earth-shattering work on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel just a year before Leonardo's arrival. The other star was the young, charming, and impossibly prolific Raphael, who was busy decorating the Pope's private apartments, the Stanze della Signatura, with his harmonious and majestic frescoes. The papal court was a hive of frantic, monumental creation, and Leonardo was left on the sidelines. The Pope gave him a handsome stipend and a suite of rooms in the Corte del Belvedere, the papal palace, but he received no major commissions. There were no grand chapels to paint, no ducal monuments to sculpt. To the new pope, Leonardo was perhaps too slow, too unreliable, too much of a brooding intellectual. His mind, which had always been his greatest asset, was now seen as a liability. He was treated less like a working artist and more like a curious relic. His bitterness is palpable in his notebooks. He writes, "The Medici made me and destroyed me." He watched as lesser talents were given the grand projects he craved. He spent his days in his workshop, surrounded by his loyal assistants, including the devoted Francesco Melzi, a young Milanese nobleman who had become his student and surrogate son. He turned his energies away from art and deeper into the labyrinth of his scientific obsessions. He designed a machine to mint perfect coins for the papal state. He drew up plans to drain the Pontine marshes, a vast and ambitious public health project. He became fascinated with optics, setting up an array of mirrors to study the properties of light and heat. Attempting to harness solar power, he continued to sketch his apocalyptic visions of deluges and storms, drawings where the entire world seems to dissolve into a terrifying, swirling vortex of water and wind. But even his scientific work brought him into conflict. He clashed with a pair of German mirror makers also employed by the Pope, accusing them of stealing his ideas. And his most secret passion, his anatomical research, was brought to a sudden and definitive end. Someone denounced him to the Pope, reporting on his nocturnal dissections. Leo X, while more worldly than his predecessors, could not publicly sanction such a practice. He forbade Leonardo from continuing his work. The man who sought to understand the very engine of life was now barred from his laboratory. He was a caged giant, a titan from the heroic age of the Renaissance, now living in an era of polished, courtly grace. He had outlived his own time, but across the Alps, a new power was rising, a young and ambitious king who had not forgotten the master's work. His name was Francis I, the new king of France. Francis was the embodiment of the Renaissance monarch, a warrior, a poet, and a passionate lover of art. As a young man, he had invaded Italy and recaptured Milan, where he had seen and been stunned by the Last Supper. He did not see Leonardo as a relic of the past. He saw him as the greatest mind of the age, a living treasure to be acquired. In 1516, the king sent Leonardo an invitation he could not refuse. He was not offered a commission with a deadline. He was offered a title, premier painter, architect at Mécanicien du Roi, first painter, architect, and engineer of the king. He was offered a handsome pension and a beautiful home, the Château du Clos-Luce, a manor house in the idyllic Loire Valley, a short walk from the king's own royal residence, the Château d'Amboise. He was not being asked to produce. He was being asked simply to be. And so, at the age of 64, Leonardo made his final journey. He packed his belongings and, accompanied by his faithful Melzi and his longtime servant, he crossed the Alps on the back of a mule. He brought with him no great blocks of marble or plans for a new cathedral. He brought only what was most precious to him, the works that had become his private companions. A handful of paintings, including his haunting St. John the Baptist and the Virgin and Child with St. Anne, and, of course, the portrait of the Florentine merchant's wife, the painting he had been working on for over a decade, the one he could never bring himself to finish or part with, the Mona Lisa. And most importantly, he brought his notebook's chest filled with thousands of pages of loose-leaf paper, the sprawling, chaotic archive of his entire life's work. In France, Leonardo found a peace he had not known for decades. The Château du Clos-Luce became his sanctuary. According to legend, a secret underground tunnel connected his manor to the king's chateau, and Francis I would visit him almost daily. The young king did not demand paintings or war machines. He would simply sit for hours, listening. He treated Leonardo not as a servant, but as a father figure, a philosopher, a sage. He would ask Leonardo about the course of the stars, the nature of virtue, the secrets of art and engineering. For the first time, Leonardo had a patron who was interested not just in the products of his genius, but in the process of his mind. Freed from the pressure to perform, Leonardo turned his full attention to the one great project he still hoped to complete. It was not a painting or a sculpture. It was his empire of paper. He spent his final years attempting to bring order to the chaos of his manuscripts. He sat with Melzi, sorting through the thousands of pages, trying to organize a lifetime of observations into a coherent whole, a great encyclopedia of everything. Here was his true, unfinished masterpiece. It was a universe of thought, drawings of the turbulent flow of water, so accurate they prefigure modern chaos theory, anatomical studies of a woodpecker's tongue, showing the bizarre mechanism that protects its brain from the force of its pecking, designs for flying machines based on the anatomy of a bat's wing, plans for a city with 2 levels, one for pedestrians and one for traffic, studies on geology, botany, acoustics, optics, and military strategy. It was the work of a man who wanted to know everything, to see everything, and to write it all down. He was trying to create a unified theory of the world, a blueprint of God's creation. His health began to fail. A stroke in 1517 paralyzed his right hand. As a left-hander, he could still write and draw, but it was a sign that his time was running out. His final drawings are of himself, a bearded, weary old man, his face a mask of wisdom and disillusionment. On April 23, 1519, knowing the end was near, he dictated his last will and testament. He was meticulous. He left money for the poor, stipends for his servants, and his vineyard near Milan to his one-time assistant Soleil, the beautiful, thieving boy who had been with him for years. But the greatest inheritance, the true treasure, he bequeathed to his most loyal companion, to Francesco Melzi. He left each and every one of the books, and all other instruments and portraits pertaining to his art and craft as a painter. He was entrusting the entire universe of his mind to the one person he knew would understand its value. 9 days later, on May 2, 1519, Leonardo da Vinci died at Clausewitz. He was 67 years old. The Greek biographer Vasari tells a beautiful, though likely invented, story of his death. He writes that King Francis I was at his bedside, and that Leonardo, seized by a paroxysm, the forerunner of death, rose up to sit in his bed. To show his reverence for the king, as he did, the king sustained his head to give him help and favor. In order to alleviate his pain, the spirit of Leonardo, which was divine, knowing that it could not have a greater honor, expired in the arms of the king. The story is a myth. Court records show the king was elsewhere on that day, but like all good myths, it speaks to a deeper truth. It shows the immense reverence in which he was held. A king cradling the head of an artist, the ultimate symbol of the power of genius being recognized, finally and absolutely, by the power of the state. His body was buried in the church of St. Florentin in Amboise. But during the French Revolution, the church was ravaged and destroyed. His tomb was broken open, his bones scattered. In the end, even his physical remains were lost to the chaos of the world. A fittingly ephemeral end for a man whose true substance was never made of flesh and bone, but a pure intellect. Conclusion: the unreachable mind. So who was Leonardo da Vinci? Was he the divine artist, the painter of sublime, transcendent beauty, whose Last Supper captured the soul of man at a moment of crisis? Or was he the detached, immoral engineer, the man who designed armored tanks and served the bloody tyrant Cesare Borgia, without a single recorded word of protest? Clearly, Leonardo's legacy has two sides to it. For centuries, the world knew only one. After his death, his loyal student Francesco Melzi carried the chest of notebooks back to his villa in Italy. He spent the next 50 years of his life trying to catalog and organize the vast, scattered archive, a task he recognized as monumental. But after Melzi died, his heirs, who had no concept of what they possessed, began to sell it off. The empire of paper was broken apart. The notebooks were scattered to the winds, sold to collectors across Europe, cut up, and bound into different volumes for almost 300 years. Leonardo the scientist, the engineer, the anatomist, the true universal genius, was lost to history. The world knew only the painter of the Mona Lisa. It was only in the 19th and 20th centuries, as these lost notebooks were rediscovered and painstakingly reassembled, that the other Leonardo, the darker, more complex, and arguably more profound Leonardo re-emerged. And this forces us to ask the central question: was his relentless, omnivorous curiosity a gift to the world, or a kind of curse? Was his intellectual detachment a necessary component of his genius, or was it a profound moral failing? He pursued knowledge with an intensity that bordered on the inhuman. He treated a study of the eddies in a river with the same passionate precision he applied to the smile of a woman. He designed a machine to kill hundreds of men with the same cool ingenuity he used to stage a courtly pageant. The art historian Kenneth Clark wrote that for Leonardo, the final object of his research was always knowledge. He was driven by a pure, unquenchable thirst to understand, to see the moral implications of that knowledge. What a patron like Cesare Borgia might do with his maps seems to have been a secondary concern, or perhaps no concern at all. Was this the price of his genius? To see the world not in terms of good and evil, but as a series of fascinating problems to be solved? To stand slightly apart from humanity in order to understand it completely? Today, his most famous creation, the Mona Lisa, hangs in the Louvre in Paris, is the most famous, most valuable, most parodied work of art in human history. Millions of people flock to see it every year, gazing at it through layers of climate-controlled, bulletproof glass. They come to see that famous, enigmatic smile, a smile that seems to contain a universe of knowledge, yet betrays nothing, a smile that is serene, yet unsettling. It is the perfect, final metaphor for the man who created it. He was a man who dedicated his entire life to observing and recording the world in unprecedented detail. And yet, he himself remains the ultimate enigma. We can study his notebooks, analyze his brushstrokes, and read his words, but the man himself remains just beyond our grasp. He showed us how the heart pumps blood, how a bird hangs in the air, how light falls on a folded cloth, but the inner workings of his own soul remain a secret. And so, 5 centuries later, the man who knew how to see everything remains the one thing we can never fully see ourselves. But if you think Leonardo's story of artistic rivalry and dark patronage is shocking, wait until you hear about the violent, scandalous, and revolutionary life of the man who was his exact opposite, Caravaggio. Just click the thumbnail on screen now, and I'll see you there in a second. Cheers.